Detective recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a crime film called Catch Me If You Can. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. A young man named Frank Abagnale Jr. lives a prosperous and stable life in New Rochelle, New Jersey, with his parents Frank Sr. and his French mother, Paula. One evening, the New Rochelle Rotary Club offers Frank Sr. a token of achievement. Frank Jr. looks to his father with pride and admiration from the front seat. Back at home, Frank Sr. recounts how he met his wife Paula while Frank Jr. and his mother are dancing. His mother ends up spilling wine on the carpet, so Frank Jr. goes to the kitchen to get a towel. When he returns to the living room, he watches his parents lovingly dance to Ella Fitzgerald's Embraceable You. Early the next morning, Frank Sr. wakes his son abruptly and tells him not to go to school and come with him to a big meeting instead. The two drive up to a tailor to borrow a black suit, but the woman rejects them, saying that they don't open for half an hour and that they don't lend suits. In response, Frank Sr. produces a gold necklace from his pocket and asks the woman if it was hers. Moments later, Frank and his son drive up to Chase and Manhattan Bank with Frank Jr. donning the black suit. Frank tells him to wait in the car and asks him why the Yankees always win. To this, he tells him that people can't take their eyes off of the pinstripes, teaching Frank Jr. to value deviousness and misdirection. Frank Sr. then enters the bank to loan some money, but the teller refuses because Frank Sr. was being investigated for tax fraud. In the end, Frank Sr. fails to borrow money and trades their car instead. Later, the Abagnale family is forced to move out of their home because of their continued financial decline and Frank Sr.'s tax fraud issues. Despite this, Frank Sr. continues to do his best to do good for his son. Frank Sr. gave his son a checkbook on his 16th birthday and opened an account for him at a bank with $25 inside it. Still knee-deep in their financial throes, Frank Jr. is forced to go to a public school. On his first day, he wears his private school uniform since he doesn't know what else to wear, and he's gotten used to wearing it. When he enters the school, the local bully greets him with a shove. Frank Jr. makes his way to his classroom, and one of the kids remarks that he looks like a substitute teacher. This gives him the impromptu idea to pose as a substitute teacher, so he starts ordering the kids to sit, and they comply. He then proceeds to teach the class and uses the opportunity to humiliate the bully who shoved him earlier, leaving the boy flustered and thinking that he had picked on an actual teacher. A few weeks pass by, and Frank Jr.'s parents were called on by the principal. He reports that Frank Jr. had been posing as a substitute teacher for weeks now, and he's even held a parent-teacher conference. His parents are surprised by this, but Frank's father secretly takes pride in his son's shenanigans. Back at home, Jr. is shocked to find his father's friend Jack leaving the bedroom with his mother. Frank Jr. is completely taken aback and his mother, despite her discomfort, tries to keep him quiet with money. He then goes to his room and shuts the door. Some time passes by, and Frank Jr. comes home to yet another man in their house. Jr. lashes out, outraged, but the man calms him down and takes him to the room where his parents are waiting for him. The man is an attorney, and he tries to explain that Frank Jr.'s parents are getting a divorce. They hand him an official document, asking him to write the name of the parent he wants to go with for custody. Filled with emotion, the perplexed boy is unable to come to a decision, so he bolts out of the room and runs straight to the train terminal in a panic. For the next few months, Frank bounces back and forth between hotels and other odd places to get himself on his feet using the checkbook his father gave him. The checks were all fraudulent, however, since he didn't have any money whatsoever. One day, Frank, who is still a minor, tries to pass off as an older professional to get a loan. He learns how to tamper with documents and checks to get his way, but he gets rejected by every bank he goes to since he was still starting to learn. As Frank leaves another bank from a failed loan, a dignified pilot, together with several young and beautiful flight attendants, gets down from a cab. Frank is completely entranced by the fabulous display and the admiration surrounding the pilot. Inspired, Frank gets the idea to pose as a pilot himself. He pretends to be a high school student writing an article for the school paper and interviews a professional from the airport. Through this, he gathers all the needed information that he could use to impersonate a pilot. He then makes some phone calls to get into some of Pan Am Air's uniform suppliers. Through his connivances, he receives an official uniform and even creates fraudulent payroll checks that Pan Am Air employees could cash in. However, his constant lying one day bites him back when he is boarded on a plane as a deadhead, not knowing what it meant. Frank Jr. makes the acquaintance of the pilots and the flight attendants. Luckily for him, a deadhead is airline slang for a pilot tagging along on a free ride to be repositioned for an assignment and not someone responsible for manning a flight of his own. Over time, he's able to accumulate millions worth of forged checks using his slick charms and clever trickery. One afternoon, Frank meets with his father to surprise him with a Cadillac. While Frank Sr. is grateful, he refuses to use it because the IRS will think it's suspicious. He then becomes tearful as Frank Jr. brings up his mother. Still, Frank Sr. promises to continue fighting for her and to bring their family back together, which Frank Jr. wants more than anything else. Carl Hanratty, a no-nonsense and determined FBI agent, begins to track down Frank because of his check frauds. Carl manages to arrive at the hotel Frank is currently staying in. He springs into action and heads for Frank's room. Frank is on the way to his hotel room when he passes by Mr. Murphy, a blind old man aided by his companion on the way out the hallway. Frank greets Mr. Murphy and enters his hotel room. Carl arrives in Frank's room holding out a gun. He searches the room for Frank, who then appears from the bathroom. Despite his intrusion, Frank looks at Carl in a poised and calm manner before telling him that he is Agent Barry Allen from the Secret Service. While this lowers Carl's guard, he still demands identification from him. Just before Carl could open Frank's wallet, he directs him to the window, saying that his partner is apprehending the criminal already. Carl looks out and sees Mr. Murphy being assisted to his car by his companion. This convinces him, and he eases up, so Frank makes his leave while his wallet is still with Carl. The man slumps down on the bed and checks the wallet, only to find it devoid of any identification cards. When he looks out the window, Frank is already running. Frank has escaped and continues to learn more about aviation by continuing to pose as a student writing a paper. Eventually, the airline professional stops him and tells him to leave, but not before handing him a news article about a con artist posing as a pilot around airlines called the Skyway Man. In the article, he's called the James Bond of the sky. The remark inspires Frank to see the latest Bond flick, and he then buys the exact suit and car that James Bond wore in the movie. He goes to a hotel and meets a seductive woman with who he ends up spending the night. On Christmas Eve, Carl Hanratty sits alone at his desk in the office while everyone else is with their families. Carl suddenly receives a call on the phone and hears Frank's voice. He apologizes for fooling him before and tells Carl that he wants to meet in a hotel. But Carl calls it a bluff and disregards the whole thing. He proceeds to upset Frank by pointing out that the only reason he's calling him is that he has no one else to call. Frank then hangs up, and Carl is left getting a kick out of it. The following day, Carl spends his morning in a diner. He also looks up Barry Allen in the phone book and sees several addresses of people listed under the name. A young waiter happens to see his papers and asks him if he's a fan of Barry Allen, with Barry Allen being the true identity of the fictional superhero The Flash. This is when Carl realizes that Frank is just a kid. With this new information in mind, he calls his partners to look up every missing child case to try and find Frank. Eventually, Carl and the FBI agents find Frank's mother, Paula. Paula, who now has remarried, cooperates with the FBI agents. She hands them a picture of her son from his yearbook, allowing Carl to identify Frank and get his name. Meanwhile, Frank is living it up as he started using his money to throw parties. At one such party, a friend of his gets into an accident, and he has to see him in the hospital. There, he meets a young nurse named Brenda Strong. The two of them build a connection and are immediately enamored by each other. Frank claims to Brenda that he is a doctor and he's looking for a job. It's unclear at first why he decided to impersonate a doctor, but later, in a letter to his father, he states that he's tired of running and wants to find someone to settle down with, hinting at his affection towards Brenda. Frank manages to con his way into becoming a doctor named Frank Connors with a supervisory position. In the hospital, Frank and Brenda's affection blossoms into a romance when the two of them share a kiss one day in Frank's office. However, the kiss is interrupted when Frank gets called into the ER. The staff there asks for advice on what to do with a young boy who had a bike accident. Despite his lack of any formal knowledge, he fakes his way out of the situation and gets away with it. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty visits Frank Sr., and from their meeting, Carl immediately observes where Frank Jr. inherited his sly personality from. Frank Sr. is evasive with his answers whenever he's asked about Jr., but before Carl leaves, Frank Sr. tells him that he'll never give up his son. This is when Carl spots Frank Jr.'s letter splayed out on the table, and he takes note of the address. After some time, Frank expresses his genuine feelings for Brenda and even asks to marry her. They both agree to meet Brenda's parents over lunch. While they were there, Frank mentions that he's also a lawyer like Brenda's father. This is news to Brenda, and she excitedly tells her father to let Frank work for him in his law office. Later on, Brenda's father confronts Frank about who he really is. To this, Frank says, "I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an airline pilot. I'm nothing really. I'm just a kid who's in love with your daughter." Luckily for him, Brenda's father misinterprets this as some metaphor and gives Frank his blessing. Frank eventually ends up passing the Louisiana board exam and begins his work with Brenda's father. There, he tries to learn what he can about law but gets yelled at by a judge when he mishandles some procedures. At the Strong residence, Frank is beginning to feel dejected when he watches Brenda and her family having a happy time together because he remembers his own family, which is now broken. Frank meets with his father in a bar and tells him eagerly that they'll get their family back. Frank Sr., who's now working in the post office, tells his son that his mother Paula has already remarried, upsetting Frank Jr. He tells his father that he wants to stop running, but his father encourages him to continue. With that, Frank Jr. leaves. It's Christmas Eve, and once again, Frank gives Carl a call. He tells him he wants a truce and he's getting married soon. Carl then says that he doesn't have a choice and that he needs to catch him because it's his job. Frank tells him that he just thought he should ask, then greets him Merry Christmas before hanging up. Carl has his new lead when he realizes that Frank won't be changing his last name this time since he's going to get married. It's not long before Carl finds his way into Frank and Brenda's wedding party. When Frank sees Carl coming, he retreats to his room, and Brenda follows after him. He finally tells her everything and then gives her instructions to meet him after 2 days at the airport. The couple bid each other a heartbreaking goodbye just after their very union. Carl steps into the room, but Frank is already gone. 2 days later, Frank is waiting for Brenda at the airport. He spots her in a pink top carrying her luggage. He is elated to see her but is quickly disappointed when he notices Brenda seeming to heed instructions from a concealed earpiece. Frank surveys the surroundings and anticipates the FBI, causing him to leave. Frank then hatches a plan to get to the airport again. He poses as a pilot once more and comes up with a fake internship program that he offers to 8 young women from a nearby school. Carl, who has about 100 men on airline security, watches out for Frank, but Frank only steps right into the door in his pilot outfit with his entourage of beautiful flight attendants to distract the attention of the all-male security officers. Frank eludes them once again and flies straight out of the country. 7 months later, the FBI grows weary of catching Frank, with the sole exception of Carl, who still has every intention of capturing him. Eventually, Carl realizes that the checks retrieved from Frank were all real checks. This leads him to ask some experts about what kind of machine could produce that kind of checks. The experts mention those machines exist in other countries as well. Carl then remembers their conversation with Paula, and he figures that Frank might be in his mother's village in France. Carl finally tracks down Frank in Montrichard. It's Christmas Eve, and a crowd of people gathers at the nearby chapel. He enters the check factory and finds Frank producing checks by the hundreds. A scared and exhausted Frank welcomes Carl like an old friend. At this point, Carl is concerned and protective, almost, so he tries to convince Frank to give up. He tells him that with the French police's anger and embarrassment, they are now planning to kill him. Frank finally lets Carl take him, but when they go outside, he is taken by the French police to their local prison. There, he almost dies 2 years later due to the poor conditions. Eventually, Carl finds a way to take Frank back home to the United States. While they're on the plane, Carl informs Frank that his father has died. Grief-stricken, Frank escapes from the plane through the bathroom stall. He hurriedly goes to where his mother and her new husband live. Despite all his staggering efforts, Frank only ends up getting the last bit of hope sucked out of him. He sees that his mother has moved on with her life, and she now has a young daughter. Devoid of both his father and any chance of bringing his family back, Frank loses the will to go on. Finally, he surrenders to Carl, who arrived with the FBI. He is then sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison. During his sentence, Carl visits Frank every now and again. During one such visit, he shows Frank a fraudulent check that he's working on. Frank instantly identifies that the teller is involved in the scheme. Impressed, Carl convinces the FBI to let Frank serve the rest of his sentence working for the FBI in the FBI bank fraud unit. Frank agrees to this and begins working with Carl, much to the hesitation of other FBI members. One day, while Frank is walking down the street, he finds a tailor shop with a pilot uniform displayed, reminding him of his former exploits. With the weekend coming in, the sorrow creeps to Frank as he's left with no friends or family to support him. This causes him to backslide into his old habits, and that weekend, he dons a pilot uniform to try and board a plane. Before he could, Carl intercepts him and tells him that no one's chasing him anymore. If he's planning to go, Carl won't stop him because he knows he'll be back. Monday comes, and Carl nervously waits on Frank with what decision he's made. To his relief, Frank soon comes back, and he helps Carl with the case. Finally, Frank has found himself a place to belong. Frank Abagnale Jr. has since then been married for 26 years and resides in the Midwest with his 3 sons. Frank has built a successful living as one of the world's leading experts on bank fraud and forgery, and he maintains a friendship with Carl Henratti. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.